International financial institutions and African leaders have warned that the continent needs tens of billions of dollars in additional money to fight the coronavirus pandemic. In a joint statement, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund said that Africa needs a total of $114 billion, out of which only $57 billion have so far been pledged. In another statement, the South African President and the African Union Chairman said the pandemic has already had a devastating impact on the continent, and its effects will deepen as the rate of infection rises. The World Health Organization has also expressed deep concern.
In the past week, there has been a 51% increase in the number of reported cases in my own continent, Africa, and a 60% increase in the number of reported deaths. With the current challenge of obtaining testing kits, it's likely that the real numbers are higher than reported. With WHO support,
Tedros said the WHO has provided African countries with testing kits, but he warned that there are still significant gaps in access to the testing capacity. The total death toll from COVID-19 has reached 1,000 in Africa. Algeria and Egypt account for more than half the figure. Tony Gosling is an investigative journalist who joins us to share with us his thoughts on this. So we're looking at the continent of Africa in this case, obviously a continent that for the most part does depend on aid and does need aid, and now you have the COVID-19 that is just starting to show itself there from the looks of it. How dire a situation do you think we're looking at when it comes to Africa and the pandemic?
Well, look, first of all, you're saying it's dependent on aid. You're absolutely right. And that is not an accident. This is deliberate because now the IMF and the international financial institutions, they have a new form of colonialism. When the European powers withdrew after World War II from Africa, so-called giving independence, they then went on to assassinate many of the local leaders that took over, and then they used the IMF and the international financial architecture to enslave Africa in debt, giving basically corrupt leaders that they controlled enormous amounts of money to spend as if there was no tomorrow, and leaving later generations, that is the people over the last 20 or 30 years, to pay back the debt. So there doesn't need to be the tough hand of the European slave masters marching around Africa anymore. The IMF is basically doing their job for them. As for the virus, well, I think what we'll see in Africa much more is people catching the virus, because that's simply the way that it's been happening in many countries that do not have a rigid healthcare systems, that do not have the money to spend on policing these lockdowns that we've had in Europe, that sort of thing. Then people will be probably catching this, and some will be dying, but not necessarily as many as is being hyped. I think there's a lot of exaggeration of the figures. What's been happening right across the West is that people who are dying with COVID-19 are being slated as dying of COVID-19. So that is to say that many of them have got underlying health conditions anyway, and as with many of these flu-like viruses, they kill tens of thousands of people sometimes in a bad year. So I think we'll see a herd immunity developing effectively in Africa to this, and there's been African vaccination programs by the Gates Foundation, by the way, which have ended up giving people the disease they're supposed to be being vaccinated against. So there's a deep mistrust in Africa of any kind of attempt to come up, well, once the vaccine appears, to come up with some sort of vaccine cure to this. So as for the money side of things, well, of course, the IMF have got to fork out the money for this. They've already slated $57 billion in aid and loans this year, but they're going to have to come up with at least double that to make sure that this, at least that the African countries have got a good chance of fighting this virus, which, it has to be said, and much so the Western media are not talking about this at all, it is potentially a man-made virus, which is this is sitting in the background and will have to be pulled apart as we come to the end, hopefully, of these lockdowns and of this vaccine crisis.
Well, when we take a look at the continent as a whole, it's been undermined, it has been pillaged, something that is well known. And of course, now that which seems like it's just a matter of when, the IMF is going to come to the rescue, which in a sense, is going to be very hard and strained for this organization because already it has to loan out money to a variety of countries. Do you think that this will be another way for the continent to continue being, so to speak, pillaged from the natural resources that it has with these loans that are going to be given out?
Well, I mean, we should be looking at gifts. We should be looking at gifts to African nations, not loans. It's very easy to accept a loan to get you out of a short-term crisis, but what quite often happens is people don't think about the long-term consequences of having to pay that loan back. We're in a situation, the average in Africa at the moment, right this minute, is 46% of the economies of those African countries are debt. So much of the activity that's taking place is to pay taxes to governments to repay debt, and to banks, of course. But I mean, you cannot continue as a viable continent or a viable country when you're spending so much of your time and effort. Basically, you're drowning in debt. You know, we've got a topsy-turvy situation going on. People are serving the money system, embodied in this case by the IMF, where the money system should be serving the people. So we're going to have a paradigm shift at the IMF in the international financial architecture, Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland, and similar organisations. And it was interesting to see that Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, and one of the senior members of the BIS in Basel, they call the Tower of Basel, which is the central banker's central bank, he was saying in November last year in the UK, I think it was in the Telegraph or the Guardian, he was saying that the international financial architecture is going to have to change and that they should embrace the cryptocurrencies. Now, I'm not saying that's a good idea, but I think there's definitely signalling from the very top of the international financial system that maybe the IMF is past its sell-by date.
Thank you so much for that. We appreciate it. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist. Many thanks.